The summer of 1885 came heavy over Willow Hollow, the kind of heat that makes even the trees seem to whisper. The hills were quiet that year, wrapped in a golden haze, when a lone surveyor named Thomas Keller passed through the valley. He was a practical man, the kind who trusted the compass more than the cross. But in his worn leather journal, he wrote about something that no map could hold. He said that at dusk, while walking the ridge above the hollow, he saw a farmhouse bathed in lamplight. In its upper window stood 3 girls, identical in face and form, their hair braided the same, their eyes fixed on something unseen beyond the glass. They were singing, he wrote, softly at first, then louder, their voices blending so perfectly that it sounded like one voice breaking into 3. Behind them, in the shadow of the curtain, he saw the shape of a man, still as stone, watching. Thomas thought it was strange but harmless until the next morning when he returned and found the house gone silent. The windows were shuttered, the air heavy with the faint scent of smoke. He moved on, thinking nothing more of it, until weeks later the papers reported a fire in Willow Hollow. The Breen farmhouse, they said, burned to the ground in the middle of the night. No survivors, no cause. The neighbors swore they had heard singing just before the flames rose high enough to light the hills. When the sheriff's men sifted through the ash, they found something that didn't fit the story of an accident. The fire had started in the cellar, deep underground, as if it had been meant to consume from beneath. The remains they gathered were few. Bones blackened and fused. A child's locket melted into the shape of a tear. The town buried what they found without ceremony. No names marked. No priest called. They said it was better that way, easier for the living. The story slipped into silence, a cautionary whisper told to children about obedience and sin. But Willow Hollow never forgot. Travelers spoke of seeing shapes move through the mist at night, 3 figures gliding near the field where the house once stood. The earth there never grew anything again. Nearly a century later, when a local historian uncovered a set of old diaries belonging to a traveling preacher, the past began to stir again. His pages described visits to the Breen home and prayers spoken not to God, but to something older. He wrote of a father who claimed his daughters were chosen vessels, their voices carrying a divine resonance, and of a night when the preacher was told never to return because the final hymn was almost ready. The handwriting broke off after that. No signature, no ending, just one last line written in a trembling hand. The fire was not judgment, it was offering. Some say the hollow still holds that echo, soft and distant, 3 voices rising from beneath the soil when the air turns warm and still. And if you listen closely, just before dawn, you might hear the faintest harmony calling for the Father who never left. Reverend Silas Breen came to Willow Hollow in the spring of 1877, carrying little more than a Bible, 3 small girls, and a voice that could make even the faithless bow their heads. He called himself a messenger, a man touched by divine sight. The town welcomed him at first, grateful for a preacher who spoke not from pride, but from trembling conviction. He said his visions came through his daughters, triplets born under a blood moon, he claimed, each bearing a part of heaven's voice. Their names were Clara, Ruth, and May. The townsfolk remembered their strange calm, how they moved in perfect rhythm, how one would finish another's sentence without thought. It wasn't rehearsed, it was instinct, like breath. On Sundays, the Reverend would place them in front of the congregation. Their voices rose together, soft at first, then layered into something too pure to be human. Some wept. Others turned away. The hymns felt wrong somehow, like they reached for something older than scripture. Afterward, Silas would close his eyes, whispering words no one could understand. His daughters standing still beside him, their pupils wide as night. When Mrs. Breen died suddenly that winter, the Reverend's grief turned inward. He stopped preaching in the church and shuttered its doors, saying the Spirit had chosen a new altar. From then on, worship was held inside the farmhouse, and no one was invited. At night, neighbors passing by claimed to hear the low hum of music, not from voices but from beneath the ground, like the sound of a cello bow dragging across stone. They said candlelight flickered under the floorboards, and the windows glowed even when no flame could be seen. Children dared each other to approach the porch, but none ever made it past the gate. Over the years, Silas's sermons vanished from public record, but his private journals survived, found decades later behind a false wall. The pages were uneven, smeared with wax, written in the same verse-like cadence he once preached from. Every entry circled back to a single phrase, repeated over 100 times, sometimes in ink, sometimes in blood. The Father, the daughters, the one flesh. Scholars tried to interpret it as metaphor, a symbol of unity, of faith's bond between generations. But those who read beyond the first pages said it didn't feel like devotion. It felt like obsession. The later passages spoke of purification through closeness, of spirit made stronger through shared breath, and of a night soon to come when the Father would be made whole again. No one knows what he meant by that, or why he believed his daughters were the key. But even now, when the wind passes through the hollow and the air carries a faint hum, locals say it sounds like three voices bound together, singing the Father's gospel into the dark. The records were sealed for almost a century, hidden behind the dust of courthouse drawers and the polite silence of a town that preferred not to remember. But inside those yellowed pages was the voice of a woman who saw too much. Her name was Eliza Horn, 17, quiet and desperate for work when she entered the Breen farmhouse in 1884. The Reverend told her she would be tending to the girls, helping with their meals, their dresses, their prayers. At first, she said, it seemed ordinary enough. The triplets were gentle, soft-spoken, always together. But after sunset, the house changed. Eliza described hearing the Reverend read scripture in a strange rhythm, the words twisted, familiar yet wrong. She said he called it the cleansing, and that his daughters would appear in white linen gowns, their hands joined, their eyes closed. He would stand before them with a candle raised, whispering verses she couldn't recognize. Then, slowly, the girls began to sing. Not hymns, something lower, older, something that vibrated through the walls. Their father's voice joined theirs, trembling with feverish devotion. One night, curiosity overcame her fear. Eliza crept up the stairs and peered through a crack in the attic door. What she saw made her drop the tray she was holding. The girls stood in a circle, their skin glistening under candlelight, streaked with honey and ash. Their father's hands trembled as he placed his palm over each of their hearts, murmuring about purity and rebirth. Then one of the girls, she didn't say which, began to shake violently, her body bending backward, her mouth open but no sound coming out. The others did not move. They simply watched, their faces blank, as the Reverend whispered that the spirit was entering her. Eliza ran that night, barefoot through the field, too frightened to look back. When she reached the neighboring farm at dawn, her clothes were torn, her voice hoarse from screaming. She told them everything, begged them to help. But when the sheriff came to question her, she had already vanished. 3 days later, they found her by the river, half buried in mud, her hands folded neatly over her chest. The coroner wrote that it was suicide, a girl overcome by hysteria. But the sketches found in the archive tell another story. They show patterns carved into her skin, delicate, symmetrical, almost artistic. Symbols no one could identify then, though they matched the markings later discovered beneath the ruins of the Breen house. A spiral, a cross split into 3, and a series of lines that, when traced together, formed the shape of a child's face. Some say Eliza was the first offering. Others believe she interrupted something meant to stay unseen. All that's certain is that after her death, the Reverend locked the doors of the farmhouse, sealing the world outside. From then on, the only light that came from within was a dim golden flicker, and the sound, faint but steady, of voices praying for salvation that had already been damned. The night the Breen farmhouse burned, the sky above Willow Hollow turned the color of blood. Smoke rolled down the hills like fog, and the air smelled of honey and ash. By the time the neighbors arrived, the fire had already devoured the walls, rising high enough to paint the clouds. But even through the roar of the blaze, they said they heard something else, singing. 3 voices, soft and steady, carrying through the crackle of the flames. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help. It was harmony. The sheriff's report said the fire began in the cellar, spreading upward like something alive. There were no signs of lantern oil or lightning. No wind that night. Just heat that burned hotter than any wood fire should. When the blaze finally collapsed the roof, the sound stopped, and for a moment the hollow was completely still. But the men who stood there swore they saw movement through the smoke. 3 figures stepping calmly from the inferno, their dresses blackened, their faces unrecognizable but smiling as they vanished into the trees. No tracks were ever found. When daylight came, all that remained was a skeleton of brick and twisted beams. The glass from the windows had melted into strange shapes, fused into what looked like small hands pressed together in prayer. The bones recovered from the ruins were half burned, yet preserved in places as if sealed in wax. The county coroner called it an anomaly of heat. The townspeople called it a curse. The Reverend's Bible was found intact, untouched by flame, lying open to a single verse that no longer matched the words of any scripture. Some said the ink had rearranged itself, forming new lines like a message still being written. The land was abandoned after that. Grass refused to grow, and animals avoided it as if they sensed something beneath. The townsfolk rebuilt far from the hollow, but the stories never faded. Some nights, children said they saw flickers of gold moving between the trees, like candlelight searching for a window that no longer existed. Nearly 80 years later, in 1964, a mining company purchased the old Breen property. When the machines broke ground, they struck something buried deep in the soil, fragments of porcelain, fragile and pale. Each piece, when cleaned, revealed part of a face, the set of a small jaw, the curve of a cheek, a pair of molded lips, frozen mid-song. Archaeologists pieced them together and found 3 identical masks, all made from the same cast, each one a perfect likeness of a young girl. But there was a 4th mask, smaller, smoother, unfinished. The expression was blank, as if waiting to be shaped. When the remains beneath were tested in 2003, DNA revealed 4 distinct bloodlines, 3 matching the Breen sisters, the 4th belonging to no known record. Not a relative, not a neighbor, an infant. No one could explain how the child's remains came to rest among the others, or why the bones showed no sign of burning at all. The scientists gave it a number. The locals gave it a name. They called it the one they saved. And sometimes after heavy rain, the mud at Willow Hollow still glistens, like melted wax trying to remember the shape of a hand. In the fall of 1959, 3 folklore students from Marshall University drove into Willow Hollow, chasing stories that locals told only in whispers. Their professor had sent them to collect ghost tales for a regional folklore project, but what they found was something no story could hold. The farmhouse ruins still stood then, only the foundation and parts of the floor, warped and half swallowed by weeds. The air smelled faintly of ash, though it had been 70 years since the fire. The students brought an old reel-to-reel recorder, heavy and humming with static. They took turns speaking into it, laughing nervously, trying to make light of the silence pressing around them. The woods were too still. Even the wind seemed to stop at the tree line. When they lowered the microphone near the boards that remained, one of them said it felt warm, like the earth beneath was alive. Hours passed with nothing but the quiet crackle of the machine. But when they played it back that night, they froze. Underneath their voices was a faint humming, distant, layered, impossibly smooth, 3 tones, perfectly in tune. It wasn't wind or echo, it was harmony. One of the girls in the group started crying. She said she'd heard that melody before, in a dream she couldn't remember. They replayed the tape again and again, turning up the volume until the hum filled the room. That's when they noticed it. The sound wasn't fading in or out like natural noise. It stayed even, precise, almost mechanical. When they sent the tape to an audio technician back on campus, his notes were unsettling. The frequencies matched human vocal patterns, but there was no trace of ambient sound, no air, no static, nothing. It was as if the recording had been made in a vacuum. When he slowed the playback, the voices formed words, 3 voices speaking together, one phrase repeated endlessly. We never slept. We were chosen. Within weeks, 2 of the students vanished. One was last seen leaving her dorm in the middle of the night, saying she had to go back and finish the hymn. The other was found months later, her car abandoned at the edge of the hollow, the recorder still inside. The tape had been erased, replaced by a low hum that made the speakers vibrate, as if the sound was alive. The surviving student, now an old man, gave one final interview before disappearing himself in 2002. He said that when he listens to silence, he still hears them, 3 voices beneath the floor of his mind, humming that same melody. And when he closes his eyes, he can almost see them waiting, patient and still, as if they've never stopped singing. In 2004, an Appalachian cold case task force reopened a box no one had touched in over a century. It was stored deep in the basement of the Kanawha County Archives, mislabeled and nearly forgotten. Breen family, 1885. Inside were small vials of wax-sealed tissue, still pale and pliant, preserved far beyond reason. The air around the samples carried a faint sweetness, like honey turned sour with time. Scientists expected degradation. Instead, what they found rewrote the limits of decay itself. Under the microscope, the cells pulsed faintly with color, not alive, but not entirely dead either. When the samples were sequenced, the results defied every known genetic map. Each strand of mitochondrial DNA repeated in perfect rhythm, forming loops that reflected back upon themselves, like a song caught in endless playback. There was no variance between them. No mutations, no generational drift. It was as if the same living pattern had been copied again and again, unbroken since the fire. Forensic biologists debated contamination, lab error, divine anomaly. But one young geneticist, a local named Emily Rourke, noticed something buried in the data. The same sequence appeared in medical records from nearby counties, people who had never heard the Breen name, families who swore no connection. Emily traced the samples to descendants scattered across the hills, each unaware of the others, yet sharing a strange hereditary trait, identical vocal patterns, matching the harmonic frequencies captured on the 1959 tape. When tested, their voices aligned perfectly, forming that same eerie 3-part chord when sung together. None could explain why. Some said it was coincidence. Others whispered that the blood had learned to sing. As word spread, old stories surfaced again. Locals claimed that when the moon hung low over Willow Hollow, 3 figures could be seen moving through the mist, their outlines faint, their song carried on the wind. Hikers spoke of hearing hymns from nowhere, layered voices that made their chest vibrate like a struck string. One man described it as music that feels like it remembers you. Emily became obsessed. She spent nights in the hollow recording the air, testing the soil, searching for resonance. The locals warned her that the land doesn't give back what it takes, but she stayed. On her last tape, found abandoned beside her tent, her voice trembled as she whispered that the pattern wasn't spreading, it was calling. She said the frequencies in the blood weren't random. They formed a melody, one that matched the Reverend's final sermon written in his journal, a hymn meant to bring the father and daughters together once more. When investigators played the tape's final minutes, the audio crackled, then bloomed into harmony, 3 voices, distant but clear, singing the same line over and over. We are the flesh that remembers. To this day, No one knows what became of Emily. Some say she vanished into the woods. Others claim she became part of the song itself. What happened to the Breen family was never about death. It was about inheritance, a faith so deep it changed the blood, and a melody that refused to end. The land where the Breen farmhouse once stood is fenced off now, though the fence never seems to keep people away. There's something about the hollow that pulls you in, like a breath you can't quite let go. The ground dips low where the cellar used to be, covered in weeds that never grow higher than your knees, no matter the season. On quiet nights, locals say the soil glows faintly after rain, as if the fire that took the house never truly went out. From a distance, the light looks like embers. Up close, it shifts and hums, soft as a heartbeat under the earth. Those who've trespassed tell the same story. The first thing they notice isn't what they see, it's what they feel. A warmth rising from the ground, too steady to be natural, pulsing through their shoes and into their legs. Some describe it as comforting, others as sickening, like standing over a grave that still breathes. Cameras often fail there. Batteries drain, microphones hiss, but every now and then, someone manages to capture the lights. They move in strange, deliberate shapes, 3 points forming a triangle, then a fourth flickering at the center, as though something unseen has joined them. Investigators have tried to explain it. Bioluminescent fungus, chemical runoff, magnetic disturbance. None of the tests hold for long. The readings change, the heat moves, and the air hums in ways machines can't measure. One team from a paranormal research group camped overnight near the old foundation. They recorded what they thought was wind moving through the grass. But when they slowed the audio, they heard music, faint voices in 3-part harmony, rising and falling in perfect time. Beneath it, a deeper tone pulsed, almost human, almost heart-like. The sound came not from above, but from below, echoing through the ground itself. Some say it's just the earth settling. Others know better. The locals call it the Breen Choir. They say the sisters are no longer bound by the fire or by flesh, that their father's gospel was never about heaven, but about permanence. To join his daughters, he had to make them eternal, and in some terrible way he succeeded. Those who stay long enough in Willow Hollow claim to hear words now and then, woven through the hum of the wind. A prayer, or perhaps a warning. We never left. We are still one. Visitors leave offerings at the fence. Small dolls, cracked porcelain, candles that melt faster than they should. No one knows who takes them, but they're always gone by morning. The hollow keeps its secrets, feeding on memory, on faith, on the fear of being forgotten. And when the air turns still, when the world seems to hold its breath, you can almost hear the hymn begin again, low, distant, and impossibly beautiful. It drifts through the trees, a song for those who still listen, a song for the blood that refused to die.